Hello and welcome back, everyone. Merry Christmas. Today is going to be a special Christmas episode. And we are going to be, as the title indicates, talking about Christmas 1914, but we're talking about on the Western Front. Now, some of you might have heard these stories about the Christmas truce. There are people who still think that it was made up, but I am here to tell you it wasn't. I've had a lot of fun researching this and gathering facts from eyewitness accounts, and I'm ready to share them with you. So, as always, I'm your host, Sam Wolf, and you're listening to Life of a Military Wife. Okay, so my first encounter with the Christmas truce was in the song Snoopy's Christmas. However, I thought growing up as a kid that it was a fabricated or fake story. I didn't think it was based on a real incident. And if you aren't familiar with Snoopy's Christmas, it is a song. It was written by the Royal Guardsmen back, oh, 1967. So, before I was born. But in it, it talks about Snoopy and the Bloody Red Baron, and Snoopy gets pinned by the Bloody Red Baron, and he makes some land, and then he flies off and says, "Merry Christmas," and they're like, "Was it the Christmas bells?" And anyway, I just loved that song. And then in early 2000s, I remember there being a commercial about it. And I thought, no way, this didn't really happen, did it? And so I started digging in, and sure enough, it had. The thing is, there's a lot of rumors, and people think it is exaggerated how prolific the truce was. And the more and more it's been researched, the more to come to realize it actually really was as prolific as it appears to be. So I kind of want to set the stage and tell you what really happened, or at least not every account, because like I said, it was rather widespread, but tell you the story. So here's your Christmas story from me. Setting the stage, this is World War One, and it's not like everyone imagines at first. So when the British first come over to help the French out, they send the British Expeditionary Force, which is their only real point of professional soldiers that they have. And this means that they send in the battle hardened. These people have fought in the Boer War. They've had experience. They know what they're doing. There's not a lot of volunteers at first. And the Germans send in their troops they've been training. And this is a dynamic war at first. People are going back and forth. They're trying to take land. They're trying to stop the capture of land. And finally, they hit a standstill. And it doesn't start off with like these organized trenches like we see later on in the war. But first, it starts off with your battle lines just stay put for a long time. And so people dig in and build the foxhole. And then eventually you hook up your foxhole with your buddy's foxhole. And then your whole company hooks up foxholes because it's safer to be underground where snipers can't see you than above ground. And that's really where we're at this point. We're in basically a collection of foxholes. Not fancy, they're filled with mud, they're uncomfortable. And slowly the professional soldiers are dying out. By the time Christmas or December rolls around, the British have lost 90,000 of its professional soldiers. And so a lot of these professional soldiers are being replaced by civilian conscripts, people who have signed up or enlisted, whatever. They're young kids. They're not very well trained. They've not seen a lot of war. So they're in their trenches and they're probably only about 50 yards away, less than a mile. They can see each other somewhere a little bit further away, 100 yards, but they're really close. And that's part of the reason why sniper fire is such an issue. then each segment of this had just a different composition and viewed the situation differently. The French, because this is their homes, and the Belgians too, but not quite as much as the French, are very vigorous. They're very determined to keep fighting. On the 17th of December, they attack with 250,000 men to just smash into the German lines, and they demand that the British support them in this. But only 2 battalions of the British end up participating, and those 2 battalions get slaughtered. Approximately 50% of the enlisted men are killed or wounded, and 70% of the officers. They're people left in no man's land for days trying to crawl back. And so that part of the British line was particularly bitter in regards to all of this. And the British were just demoralized. They were absolutely beaten. And so here they are in these makeshift trenches with mud and water. And then Christmas Eve comes and the water freezes. And they are just miserable. They're far from home. They've never been far from home before, many of them. They are suffering and cold, and they don't really have any shelter or good food. And then something amazing happens. You see, what a lot of us don't realize nowadays is that the British and the German had a shared culture in a lot of ways. They had shared Christmas traditions that had been established by Victoria and Albert. Queen Victoria was half German, and Albert, her husband, was fully German. And so they brought the concept of a Christmas tree and other Christmas traditions to England prior to the First World War. And so they had carols that were similar. They had Christmas traditions that were similar. But the difference is that in Germany at the time, the big celebration for Christmas started on Christmas Eve, where they would have a big family dinner and everyone would get together and there'd be singing and all of that. And they would set up the Christmas trees and everything. So the Germans, they get their mail, their Christmas mail, delivered on Christmas Eve. And many of them get Christmas trees sent from home. And they set these Christmas trees up on the parapets and they decorate with colorful lights and they are singing carols. And that confuses the British. The British soldiers are sitting there listening to singing or seeing Christmas trees. And they're confused because they're like, wait, what are they doing? And they realize they're celebrating. And in some places, some Germans are even so bold to shout out, hey, tomorrow, you know Shooty, we know Shooty. And a lot of the Germans actually spoke very good English. And that's because they had been educated in English universities. They had gone to work in England as waiters or in butcher shops. They had worked all over England, not all, but quite a few, to the point there was quite a few who spoke rather good English. So the Americans start shouting, Merry Christmas, waiter, or, and they shout back, Merry Christmas, Tommy, and or Merry Christmas, Fritz. They're just teasing each other back and forth through the night. And the next morning comes, and in some places, they just got out of the trenches and started talking. In other places, they started off with a truce. And in that time, truce, and it's still not unheard of in warfare today. We've seen it recently. But in warfare, especially back then, it wasn't uncommon to declare a temporary truce to be able to bury your dead. Ceasefires for those purposes were not atypical. And so that's how it starts off. In some cases, the British approached the German and asked for a ceasefire for the purpose of burying their dead. And in other places, the Germans approached the British. And there are instances in letters that I read where they would offer crosses. They offered crosses to the Germans to mark the burials of their dead. And they start talking and start singing carols together and swapping cigarettes. According to one of the British historians I was reading the account from, they said that the British got the better deal because they got cigars and things like that, and they just gave them corned beef. The British just handed over corned beef. But I mean, novel food is novel food. There was buttons exchanged, handkerchiefs exchanged, pictures taken, and I've actually seen pictures of the German and British soldiers together. And just in one place, and there's only record of this happening in one place, they actually had a combined Christmas service, church service. And that I think is absolutely incredible. And then we go into the stories of the football match, soccer that was played. And in the account that I encountered, basically the Germans, someone had received a soccer ball from somewhere, and they brought it out and they started, the Germans, kicking it about back and forth, just kind of, passing it around. And the British kind of joined in, and it didn't in any instance that I see turn into a official regulated, match, Germans versus British, but more kind of a kickabout is the way they put it, or a little game of keep away, that sort of thing. And just friendly, and sometimes they shared food and sometimes they just talked. Some cases it lasted just a couple hours, some cases it lasted all day and into the next day. It just depended on the area, but there were areas of the British line, those two battalions that I mentioned, that had suffered such heavy casualties that they were absolutely not having it. They were so bitter and angry for their friends that had died. And so one of the soldiers, I don't remember what provoked it, I think, but ended up shooting down all their decorations. So there was definitely places where it didn't happen, but there were places where it definitely did happen. And it's amazing to see those instances. And interesting that in many cases it was the Germans who started it first. And these stories start getting back home, and this was before censoring happened. So these stories are getting home, and all there's been in the news is the propaganda about how they're evil and they're horrible and we're going to destroy them, when your your monarchies are family. You're really not that different. The point that you're fighting this war, it's losing its impact for some of these soldiers. There's just not as much contention. And so they write home and they're like, "You'll never believe what I was doing. While you were eating your turkey, I was doing this." And they start sending home pictures and photos and mementos. A British soldier, even mailed a letter for a German soldier to his British girlfriend. There's just all of these instances where they are writing home and they're talking about it. And it wasn't just the British, it was the Germans too. And the press just eat it up because they have something uplifting to cover around Christmas time. They finally have something, what is it they call it now? A personal interest story, or, those sorts of things. And so there's a lot of embracing of this concept at first by the public, but not by the governments. They're absolutely furious about this situation. And what ends up happening is a lot of them get reprimanded, people get demoted. Some people are just there's punishments that are dealt out right and left, and threats that if this ever happens again, people will be shot. And censorship starts happening so that stories like this can't make it back home. So information they don't want can't make it back home. And I, people don't realize World War One wasn't just fought on the Western Front. There was an Eastern Front. So why didn't this happen anywhere else? Why didn't this take place anywhere else during World War One? And part of the reason is the British and the Germans did have some shared culture, especially around Christmas, due to Victoria and Albert. The second reason is calendars. At this point in time, the Russians are using the Russian Orthodox calendar for religious observations. So that puts their Christmas celebrations end of December, beginning of January. So beginning of January, really. And so they don't line up. It's not the same day. And then other places where this is being fought, in Africa, in the Middle East, they don't have a shared religious observance. There's not a shared religion and religious traditions. And so it doesn't take place everywhere. It's definitely just in segments of the Western Front. And it's not all segments, but it's large segments. And I just absolutely have always loved this story. I loved the way they could set things aside, the way they could show that love and humanity to each other, the way they could realize that maybe the other side is human too. And that doesn't always happen in war. There's definitely been instances in world history where certain groups have been rather insistent on pursuing situations and circumstances and goals that are intolerable and unethical. But there was situations like this during the Christmas truce where there wasn't a lot of animosity. This is before the mustard gas and before the established trenches and before a lot of those other things, the tanks and all the other stuff. And it didn't happen again. In fact, this is probably the last major instance of a Christmas truce in world history. And it's something I wanted to explore. I wanted to look into and share and tell the story of this Christmas. There is a Christmas carol that I believe Mark Twain was rather fond of, and my mother was as well. I remember her singing it to us, and it's called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. And it goes, I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play. Wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And then the singer goes on to say, in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks a song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. And that's not all the verses. I cut some out, but that's the gist. That's the gist of that song. And I've always loved it because there are times where it feels like the Christmas bells, the song of peace on earth, is absent, especially during these holiday seasons. But I love that response. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. And it reminds me of a modern Christmas carol, a song that I am particularly fond of and I play all the time. And I will admit, I get choked up sometimes when I hear it. And it's my Christmas list, my grown up Christmas list. And I particularly love the chorus that says, no more lives torn apart, that wars will never start, and time will heal all hearts, that everyone will have a friend, that right will always win, and love will never end. And that's the singer's grown-up Christmas list. And I have to say, if I had a grown-up Christmas list, that would be mine. That no more lives would be torn apart, and that wars would never start, and time could heal all hearts. I know that we live in an imperfect world, and I may never in my lifetime see my grown-up Christmas list completed. But that's not going to stop me from wishing for it. And I know it might sound to some a little odd that a military spouse is wishing that there would be no more war. Most military service members would be completely happy to be put out of a job, would be absolutely thrilled if there was never a need for another war and another soldier. So that's where I'm going to probably leave you this Christmas. Got a few more episodes in the works for, well, at least one more episode this year, and a lot in the works for next year. Working towards expanding access to the podcast. But most importantly, I just want to say happy holidays, Merry Christmas, whatever you do for the holidays. I hope that you're able to spend time with loved ones and find some peace in this crazy world. As always, I'm your host, Sam Wolf, and this is Life of a Military Wife.